So what I want to talk about is visual mis- and disinformation, and specifically a project that we have completed with First Draft. So this is with Claire Wardle and also our new PhD student Hannah Guy, to think about how journalists and platforms and citizens can think much more about how to spot specifically images that are playing a really, really big role in spreading mis- and disinformation. Ooh. Wow, this clicker is really sensitive. I've already given you, the images I want to talk about. Okay, so just to sort of set the stage very quickly, and I will return to this throughout what I want to talk about, is just this kind of statement to start us off, that images can be incredibly powerful. So this is something, when I talk about mis- and disinformation, and when I talk about the work that we do in the lab, everybody always goes, duh, yeah, images are really important. And everybody can always mention images that they've seen recently in the news that have played, a role in them thinking about certain issues. But what we have seen in the research that we've been doing, and I've been looking at images in newspapers and increasingly in the last sort of 15 years on social media, they just don't get the attention that I feel that they deserve. But when it comes to kind of mis- and disinformation, not only are they incredibly complex, but they are also potentially very, very dangerous because they can be so powerful. And yet, intuitively, I feel when I talk about these things with people, people know that, right? And so why is it that as a community, we don't treat them as, key vectors of spreading mis- and disinformation? So one of the things that I think is really important, and this is very much influenced by the work in the mis- and disinformation space, and again, the work of First Draft here, is do we actually know what the problem looks like? So because people tend to want to rush in very quickly with solutions, and we think we know what this mis- and disinformation problem looks like, I'm not sure we do, and I'm not sure we know what the problem looks like when it comes to images. So one of the things that I think is really important to be mindful of is if we can kind of agree that we're still figuring out what the problem looks like, can we then also agree that if we don't really know what the problem completely looks like, how can we then start to think about solutions, right? Because I think the problem is much more complex than we're currently embracing and thinking about, which means that the solutions that we're starting to think about and starting to offer are only starting to touch the surface. And I think that that's really important to hold on to, that solution space also needs to stay dynamic and critical and reflective and so on. And I think we need to do a lot more of that. So if we can then also assume that there isn't a straightforward technological solution, what then can we do? Right? So this is what I want to talk about. So you've already seen this image now. But I want to start with this image, because this is an image that I'm sure here people have also seen. It was a massive image, of course, in the USA, but also in Europe. This is the image that John Moore took for Getty of the small Honduran child, Yanela, who was separated temporarily from her mother, who was being frisked, and shone a light on and made very visible the practice of separating children from their parents in US immigration policy. So this is an image that went viral in mid-June this year. It ended up on the cover of Time magazine. And this is, I think, a really, really good example. The New Yorker had comments on it as well. I think this is a really good example of an image that can make visible a practice and a policy that has been known about and has been written about extensively, but often it takes an image to make something visible and for people to start thinking about that particular issue. And we've done in the lab, we've done a lot of work, for example, on the refugee crisis and the impacts of the refugee crisis in Europe. And it was the image of Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old refugee boy who washed up on a beach in Turkey in 2015 in September, that really made the refugee crisis visible and really started a massive public debate and discussion about this issue. So this Time cover then also went viral and was heavily contested in different ways. It got a lot of media coverage, and one of the ways in which it was contested is that it was packaged by different actors as fake news, right? That what people had now found out is that this child hadn't been separated permanently from her mother, but that this had been a temporary moment in which the image had been taken, and that therefore in certain camps this was then taken up as, well, this is fake news. We are not being shown the kind of the full picture here, and so on. And there were images circulating as well of the child again with her parents. And Time had to also publish a correction to say that the child hadn't been permanently separated from the mother. So what I think is very interesting about this image is how much discussion there was around it in terms of the power of the image to start this discussion, to make something visible, but then also how this had been then taken up by different agents in different ways. And again, in my work, I've seen this many, many times. So I did a PhD on the Palestine-Israel conflict, and there's an image that some of you may remember from 2000, maybe some of you are too young to remember, I don't know, of a young Palestinian child who was shot and killed and died in the arms of his father, Mohammed al-Dura, which set off the Second Intifada in that conflict. And again, that image is highly contested. To this day, there are court hearings and claims that the child isn't even dead. So the ways in which these images become part of a national story, I think, is also incredibly important. More recently, this image has also again been taken up with different celebrities putting pressure and publicly shaming Ivanka Trump in terms of publishing images like this of her with her children and saying she's having such a lovely Sunday morning, and people using that to say, well, how would you feel if you were separated from your child, and so on, and using Instagram, the same platform where Ivanka likes to publish a lot of her images, to put pressure on her, and this kind of Dear Ivanka movement has been kind of picking up some speed. So I think this is a really interesting example to just kind of get us started in terms of thinking about these images. So if we then move firmly into the mis and disinformation space, I want us to think back on an event that happened in the UK last year, and some of you may be familiar with this. There was an attack in Westminster where a recently converted Muslim man, was involved in a terrorist attack, and this was an image that floated around as being presented as real. It is a tube sign that sort of says, you know, this is the spirit of the city, and we've seen this many, many times before in the aftermath of these kinds of events, to say, you know, London will not be beaten, Londoners, you know, have a certain kind of characteristic. This was misinformation. This was a completely false sign, but it was read out in Parliament, and it got a lot of attention. Now, this image, which might also be one that you've seen before, is of a whole different order. So this is also in the aftermath of that attack, of a Muslim woman walking past one of the victims of the attack, and the way in which it's presented is it's shown as if she doesn't care, right? So this, of course, was then seized upon by internet trolls. Initially, this is what we thought, and this is a really prominent example that got a lot of media coverage, but what we found out much, much later is that this was actually a Russian agent, and that this was part of a concerted disinformation campaign, right? So what we see is we have images that float around immediately in the aftermath that are maybe easier to verify as false, and then there are images that are much, much harder to unpick that later turned out to be part of a state-sponsored disinformation campaign, but the damage has already been done, because this kind of stuff, because it feeds off hatred and it feeds off fears and Islamophobia and so on, are very, very powerful. And of course, state actors engage in these practices themselves as well. And so this is a UK politician who used the moment of the refugee crisis to essentially push for Brexit, right? So this is Nigel Farage, who plays on the fear of people having, that people have of refugees coming to the UK and presenting a really bogus argument, but using very, very powerful images to do that. So if I then turn for the final part of my presentation to the work that we've done with First Draft to look at how some of these images were used in the French and UK elections, I just want to share a few kind of key takeaways with you. So this is the overview of how we got hold of the data. So this comes from different sources for both of these elections in 2 different projects. In France, they worked with Crosscheck. In the UK, they worked with Full Fact. And together, they produced, my God, this thing is so sensitive. They together produced 95 images that we then analyzed using these different categorizations. So we looked at format, we looked at levels of accuracy using the first draft typology. You looked at what is the topic of the visual, the motivation of the visual, the origin, the location, and the source. So we did a lot of very detailed, fine-grained coding. And for example, for type, for the format, we had 21 different types of images. So some of you may be familiar with this typology that First Draft has put forward, and we used that to build it out for images, and so we ended up with 10 types of visual and misinformation specifically for images. So the ones that we added were genuine mistake, no context provided, and exaggeration. And it's also, of course, important to say that sometimes they might be accurate. So we also open up the possibility when you're dealing with this data that it might actually be accurate. So just a couple of findings then. When it comes to visual format, what we are starting to see, and we would need to do a lot more work and look at different kind of country-specific examples in addition to the UK and France, is maybe we are starting to see signals that indicate that it's certain types of images that are more prone to in that national context. And I don't know what the Argentinian national context might provide if we had that kind of data, where certain types of images are much more likely to be involved in terms of mis and disinformation. So what we see is we see some differences between the French and the UK data, for example, in terms of the use of photographs, or the use of photographs with text, or the limited use of memes, for example. Thank you. This is a really, really key takeaway. In terms of the level of accuracy, this was our biggest finding, that the biggest problem we have, both as journalists, as academics, but also as platforms and concerned citizens, is the images that are the hardest to deal with, is the images that are essentially truthful, so the image is real, but the context is false. And I will give you an example of that. This is an example of an aftermath of a football match in France from a number of years ago, where someone is walking around with a flag around his shoulders that looks like an ISIS flag. It's not an ISIS flag. This person is not an ISIS supporter. He's not a terrorist. But this image was used as part of the French elections to suggest that ISIS supporters are now roaming the streets freely and nobody's doing anything about it. Right? This is the stuff that's really hard to debunk. This is the stuff that is really, really hard to deal with algorithmically at platform level, because the image isn't altered, the image isn't fake. It's the context within which it's presented that is the problem. This is 30% of what we found. This is the biggest category of what we're dealing with. So what can be done about this? So Facebook is making efforts to start looking more at context. So there's, tentative steps on the part of the platform, but what we're suggesting is, how do you better verify and how do you better interpret this, right? This is much, much harder than simply letting an algorithm loose on this. So one of the things that I want to end on, and this is a plug for our workshop that I'm running with Anshamina, is that we are starting to develop ways in which we can draw, for example, from art history, and this is an interpretation wheel that we are using, drawing on the work from Marcia Poynton, an art historian, who uses it to interpret pieces of art. How do you do this for images? By potentially placing this image inside of the wheel and asking it all of these questions. And what we have started to find when we have been working with journalists and this interpretation wheel is that if you can answer all of these questions for the image, you actually have a really, really good sense of what is going on, and potentially you have a really strong story. If we combine that with work, again, by Claire Wardle and Hossein Darkashan, of how you interpret this at different levels and ask questions of different agents and how this image was interpreted at different time periods, I feel that we're starting to get to a point where we can start to potentially build protocols that will help, in this case, journalists to interpret images much better and write much more detailed stories about them, and also not fall foul of these kind of mis and disinformation campaigns. So if you want to come and talk to us more about this, we have a workshop at 6 o'clock, and our full report is out in September. Thank you.